the queen who gave Henry VIII his only son and was left to die. In the shadow of Hampton Court Palace, the kingdom rejoiced. Bells rang. Cannons roared. The long-awaited Tudor heir had arrived. But while the court celebrated the healthy cries of a baby boy, his mother was bleeding to death. Alone. Forgotten. She had achieved the impossible, given King Henry VIII the son he had destroyed 2 queens trying to obtain. But what was her reward? Silence. Abandonment. Death. This is not the romantic tale history textbooks pretended to be. This is the real story of Jane Seymour, the queen who succeeded where others failed, and was discarded the moment her purpose was fulfilled. Her life and death exposed the ruthless logic of Tudor monarchy, where queens were valued only for their wombs, and women were erased once their duty was done. By 1536, King Henry VIII was a man obsessed with a male heir, desperate to secure the Tudor dynasty. 2 wives had already fallen. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, had been cast aside after decades of service and died in exile. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry had torn England away from the Pope, had been executed on charges of adultery and incest, her head severed on Tower Green. Into this treacherous court stepped Jane Seymour. She was not beautiful, not witty, not fiery. She was plain, reserved, and quiet, precisely the opposite of Anne. But what Jane lacked in charisma, she made up for in calculation. Or rather, her family did. The Seymours of Wiltshire saw the writing on the wall. They had watched Anne rise and fall and understood what Henry truly wanted, a submissive, obedient vessel for a prince. Not a partner. A pawn. Jane's brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour, placed her directly in Anne Boleyn's household. There, Jane watched her predecessor's mistakes firsthand. She studied how Anne's intelligence and ambition had provoked Henry. She noted how boldness brought queens to the block. Jane learned quickly silence was survival. She presented herself as the anti-Anne. Where Anne had been outspoken, Jane was deferential. Where Anne had flaunted her education, Jane spoke only of piety and needlework. Her virtue was a mask. Her obedience, a strategy. And Henry noticed. The courtship began while Anne Boleyn still wore the crown. Henry, ever fickle, turned his eyes toward Jane and found something he craved more than beauty, control. Jane, coached by her family, played the game flawlessly. She rebuffed his gifts. She refused his letters. She allowed herself to be seen, but never alone. To Henry, this modesty was intoxicating. To Jane's handlers, it was perfect bait. By the spring of 1536, Anne Boleyn stood trial. Trumped-up charges. False witnesses. A rigged court. 11 days after Anne's beheading, Jane married Henry in a private ceremony. No grand procession. No feasting. No music. It was as if the court itself feared celebration. After all, hadn't they just cheered the last queen into her grave? Jane's trembling hands on her wedding day spoke louder than the trumpets that never played. She understood her position. She knew what was expected. And she knew what happened to those who failed. Jane Seymour's queenship was not marked by power, policy, or public life. It was marked by silence. Contemporary accounts praised her as appropriately submissive and pleasingly quiet. These were not compliments. They were warnings. Speak too loudly, and you'll meet the sword. But Jane had a single job, bear a son. In early 1537, she became pregnant. The court exhaled. Henry rejoiced. The Seymour family doubled down on their influence. Jane, meanwhile, was turned into a state project. Her meals were planned by royal physicians. Her every movement monitored. She was forbidden from viewing deformed persons for fear the baby might catch their afflictions. She was expected to pray constantly, to remain serene, and above all, produce a prince. The palace became a pressure chamber. Midwives were hired. Astrologers consulted. Rooms were sterilized, or what passed for sterilization in the 16th century. Hampton Court was chosen as the birth site, a palace drenched in both grandeur and ghosts. As her belly grew, so did her isolation. Jane no longer belonged to herself. She was no longer a queen. She was a cradle. On October 9, 1537, Jane Seymour went into labor. It lasted 3 days. She screamed. She bled. She begged. Her cries echoed through the stone walls as courtiers outside held their breath. What was happening behind the curtains would determine the future of the English crown. The birth was agonizing. What we now know was likely a breech birth. Midwives tried everything. Priests administered last rites, twice. But finally, on October 12, the cry of a baby rang out. A boy. Edward Tudor. The long-awaited male heir. England had a prince. The court exploded with joy. Bells rang across London. Bonfires were lit. Henry was ecstatic. And Jane? She was dying. Her body had been torn apart by the labor. Internal injuries. Hemorrhaging. Infection. But Henry barely noticed. He had what he wanted. A son. In the days following Edward's birth, Jane appeared to improve. She held her son. She smiled faintly. But her condition deteriorated rapidly. Her fever rose. Her strength failed. What modern medicine would identify as puerperal sepsis, a deadly postpartum infection, ravaged her from within. Treatments. Hot poultices. Bleeding. Prayer. The same court that had celebrated her compliance now watched her fade with clinical detachment. Henry focused on the prince's christening. He sent instructions for the feast, the pageantry, the symbols of victory. As Jane gasped for breath in a darkened chamber, her husband planned fireworks. Her last words were reported as apologies for failing Henry. For dying. For being mortal. Jane Seymour died on October 24, 1537, 12 days after giving Henry his heir. Her funeral was quiet. Her room stripped. Her letters burned. Henry never publicly mourned. He told foreign ambassadors the prince mattered most. He began discussions for a new marriage within weeks. But behind the scenes, the myth-making began. Jane was transformed from a broken woman abandoned by her king into a saintly martyr. Paintings showed her serene and glowing. Texts praised her piety and sacrifice. She was, they said, the perfect queen. Because she died before she could speak. Edward VI lived only 15 years. A sickly boy, burdened by prophecy and expectation. Jane's death, so glorified, had delivered not a secure dynasty, but a doomed one. Henry, meanwhile, claimed Jane had been his only true wife. A convenient lie. He had abandoned her as she died and discarded her memory until it became politically useful. The Seymour family, bloated with power, would implode. Jane's brothers fought over control of the prince and paid with their lives. And Jane? Her real story vanished beneath centuries of Tudor propaganda. But now, we remember. Jane Seymour was not just the woman who gave Henry a son. She was the woman who paid with her life to do it. Her silence was strategic. Her obedience, coerced. Her death, preventable. She was a victim of power, of monarchy, of patriarchy, of history. And her story still echoes today. If Jane Seymour's real story moved you, if you believe in telling the truth history tried to bury, subscribe. Because behind every great king lies a woman whose story was erased. And we intend to remember her.